Cowboy saw Apache forced into darkness, and the lantern lit at his feet promised retribution. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jack Morgan had lived a solitary life for as long as he could remember. The harsh, unforgiving landscape of the American frontier had shaped him, turned him into a man who trusted few and spoke to even fewer. He was a cowboy, one of the last few who roamed the wide plains, his life a routine of cattle herding and the constant solitude of his ranch. But on this particular evening, things were different. As Jack sat on the porch of his modest cabin, the orange glow of the setting sun painted the horizon, he noticed something strange, something out of place. He saw a figure in the distance, stumbling across the rugged terrain. At first, he thought it might be just another traveler lost in the vastness of the land, but as the figure drew closer, he realized it was a woman. A woman he had never seen before. Her clothes were tattered, and her movements were slow and cautious, as though she were being hunted. Jack's instincts kicked in. He rose from his chair and walked toward the woman, his boots crunching the dry earth beneath him. As he neared, he saw her face, worn and bruised, her eyes filled with fear. She was an Apache woman. Jack had heard the stories, of course. The conflicts, the raids, the tensions between the settlers and the native tribes. But he had never been one to involve himself in the politics of the land. He preferred the quiet life of his ranch, away from the disputes and violence that seemed to engulf every corner of the frontier. Yet something in the woman's eyes made him hesitate. She was clearly in trouble. "Are you all right?" Jack called out, his voice steady, though his heart raced with curiosity and concern. The woman looked up at him, startled, as if she had not expected to be spoken to. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she staggered forward, collapsing at his feet. Jack immediately knelt down, instinctively reaching out to steady her. He could see now that she was badly injured. Her arms were marked with cuts and bruises, her face pale from exhaustion and pain. He needed to act quickly. Without a second thought, Jack helped her to her feet, supporting her as they made their way to the cabin. He placed her gently on a chair by the fire, offering her water, though she could barely manage to sip it. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. Jack knew that helping this woman, this Apache woman, could bring trouble to his doorstep. He wasn't naive. The settlers had their suspicions, their prejudices, and his decision to aid her could spark anger, even violence. But there was something about her, a quiet strength that tugged at his conscience. She wasn't just any Apache woman. Jack sensed that she had a story to tell, one that went far beyond the simple circumstances of her being in his cabin. As he sat across from her, watching her fight to stay awake, Jack felt the burden of his decision settle over him. He had no idea that this woman's presence would soon set into motion a series of events that would change his life, and hers, forever. Jack watched as the Apache woman sat silently by the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows on her face. She had not spoken a word since he had helped her into the cabin, her eyes heavy with the weight of something unsaid. Jack could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had been placed upon them. She was a stranger, yet Jack felt an overwhelming urge to help her. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, as Jack tried to decide what to do next. The tension in the room was palpable, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice low and strained. "Thank you," she whispered, her words barely audible over the crackling fire. Jack nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. He had done what anyone would do in his place, yet something in her eyes told him there was more to this moment than simple gratitude. "You're safe here," Jack said, his voice steady, though his mind raced with questions. "But I need to know who did this to you." The woman looked away, her gaze distant, as if the question was one she could not answer. The air between them was thick with the unspoken, the kind of silence that held too many secrets. After a long pause, she finally spoke again, her voice shaky. "They took everything from me," she said, her eyes meeting his. "My family, my people." Jack's heart tightened at the sorrow in her voice, though he knew better than to ask too many questions. There were things in the world, things in the past, that people did not speak of lightly. He could tell that this woman carried a burden far heavier than her injuries. She had been through more than most could ever imagine. "I didn't want to involve anyone," she continued, her voice stronger now. "But I have no choice. They will come for me." Jack felt a chill run down his spine at her words. The weight of her warning settled in his chest, a knot of dread that he couldn't shake. "Who will come?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "The ones who forced me into the darkness," she said, her eyes darkening with something he couldn't quite place. "They will not stop until they find me." Jack's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle slowly starting to fall into place. This woman, this Apache woman, was not just any stranger. She was part of something much bigger, something that had been brewing for far too long. He knew the risks of getting involved. The frontier was a place of danger, and there were stories of people who had made the mistake of crossing paths with the wrong side of the law. But Jack also knew something deeper, the need to do what was right, even when it meant facing the unknown. "I won't let them hurt you," Jack said, his voice firm. He didn't know how he would stop whatever was coming, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn his back on her, not after everything she had been through. She looked at him, her eyes softening just a little. "Thank you," she said again, though her voice held the faintest trace of uncertainty. "But I am not the only one in danger." Jack nodded slowly, understanding now that whatever had happened to her, it was far from over. The storm that was coming would not pass quietly, and Jack would be right in the middle of it, whether he was ready or not. The days passed slowly in the cabin, the quiet of the wilderness outside a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. Jack Morgan kept to his usual routines, but his mind was constantly on the woman he had saved, Ayanna. She remained mostly silent, resting and recovering, but her presence seemed to linger like a shadow. He could feel it when he looked out over the plains, as if something was coming, something he couldn't control. The Apache woman had warned him. She wasn't the only one in danger. He wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he knew one thing. He was no longer just a cowboy looking after his land. He was caught in something bigger than him. Something that was moving closer every day. Jack had no illusions about the world he lived in. The frontier was unforgiving, filled with men and women alike who would do whatever it took to survive. He had lived through his own fair share of hardships, and he had learned the importance of trusting no one. But something about Ayanna made him question everything. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him when he had helped her. Or the weight of the words she had said when she spoke of those who would come for her. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set into motion, and it was only a matter of time before the storm hit. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange, Jack heard the distant sound of horses' hooves. It wasn't the usual quiet rhythm of a lone traveler passing by. No, this was different. The sound was fast, urgent. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the fading sunlight. He could see dust rising in the distance, a group of riders closing in on his property. Ayanna had been inside resting, but Jack knew she must have heard it too. She appeared in the doorway, standing tall despite her injuries, her eyes scanning the horizon with a quiet intensity. Without saying a word, Jack nodded toward the riders, his hand resting on the handle of his rifle. Ayanna didn't speak either, but Jack could see the understanding in her eyes. She knew who these riders were. He could feel the weight of the moment, the inevitability of it. They were here. And they weren't here for a friendly visit. "You should stay inside," Jack said, his voice low but steady. "I'll handle this." Ayanna shook her head slightly, her expression unreadable. She took a step toward him. "No," she said, her voice firm. They are coming for me, not you. Jack looked at her for a long moment, weighing her words. He wasn't a fool. He knew that helping her had changed everything, but this wasn't his fight. Or was it? As the riders drew nearer, Jack's instincts kicked in. The quiet of the night was suddenly filled with the sound of horses galloping, and he knew that whatever was about to happen would be a turning point. He wasn't just protecting his ranch anymore. He was protecting someone who had already been through more than most could ever imagine. The riders slowed as they approached, coming to a halt in front of the cabin. Jack could see them now, 5 men, dressed in the rough clothes of settlers, their faces hard and set with determination. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, dismounted and walked toward Jack. His eyes locked onto Iona, and Jack felt his grip tighten on the rifle. "You've been hiding something, Morgan," the leader said, his voice cold and authoritative. "We know she's here. Hand her over." Jack didn't flinch. He wasn't about to let this man intimidate him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice steady. The leader's eyes narrowed. "We don't have time for games," he said. "You know who we are. And you know what we want." Jack didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The tension between them was palpable, a silent standoff that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, the leader motioned for his men to move in, but Jack stepped forward, blocking their way. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet certainty. The leader stared at him for a moment, then glanced over at Iona, who had stepped out of the cabin, her stance strong and defiant. She looked at Jack, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, without a word, Iona stepped forward, walking toward the leader with a quiet grace. "You're too late," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to echo in the silence. Jack watched in stunned silence as the leader took a step back, his eyes flickering with something that might have been fear, or maybe respect. "This land is under my protection now," she said, her words carrying the power of someone who had been through more than most could imagine. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever was coming next, he knew one thing: this was only the beginning. The tension in the air was palpable as Jack stood there, watching Iona face down the 5 men who had come for her. The leader's eyes shifted uneasily as Iona spoke with quiet authority, and for a moment, it seemed like the air itself held its breath. Jack wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: the calm that had settled over the land for so many years was over. As the leader hesitated, glancing between Iona and his men, Jack could feel the weight of the moment. He was ready. Ready for whatever came next. Iona stood tall, her expression unreadable, her stance steady as if she had been waiting for this confrontation her entire life. The leader, seeing her unwavering confidence, shifted his weight and took a step back, his brow furrowing in frustration. "This land is under my protection now," Iona repeated, her voice calm but firm. "If you want to take me, you'll have to go through me." The leader's face hardened as he glanced over at Jack, who stood like a silent guardian, ready to protect her. Jack's hand rested on the rifle at his side, his fingers brushing the worn handle, a quiet reminder that he wouldn't let anything happen to her, not while he was still standing. The leader looked over at his men, a brief exchange of glances passing between them. He could see that they were all unsure, the certainty in Iona's words hanging in the air, like an unspoken challenge. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time. The wind rustled the leaves, the only sound breaking the silence. Then, the leader spoke, his voice tinged with reluctant respect. "We'll give you this land for now, Apache," he said. "But don't think this is over. You're not safe here." With that, he turned on his heel and motioned for his men to follow. They mounted their horses in unison, their movements quick and deliberate. As they rode off, the dust settling behind them, Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He turned to Iona, who stood quietly, watching the men leave. "You did well," Jack said quietly, his voice low but full of respect. Iona gave him a small nod but didn't speak. She simply turned and walked back to the cabin, as if the encounter had been nothing more than a passing storm. Jack followed her inside, where the fire still burned brightly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He watched as Iona sat down, her shoulders slumping slightly as if the weight of the confrontation had finally caught up with her. She had been strong, unwavering in the face of the threat, but Jack knew that even the strongest of people had their breaking points. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. Iona nodded, her gaze distant as she stared into the fire. "I'm fine," she said, her voice low. "I've faced worse." Jack didn't press her further. He knew that people like Iona, people who had lived through the hardships of the frontier, often carried scars that weren't visible to the eye. He respected her strength, but he also knew that there were things she didn't say. "You're safe here for now," Jack said, walking over to the window and looking out into the vast expanse of land. "But I won't pretend like everything's going to be all right. We're not alone out here." Iona didn't respond, but Jack could feel her eyes on him. She didn't need to say anything. She understood. They were both in this together now. Whatever danger had been lurking on the horizon, it was closer than ever. And Jack wasn't sure what the next few days would bring, but one thing was certain: he would not let Iona face it alone. The fire crackled in the hearth, the warmth of it filling the small cabin, but outside, the wind howled through the trees, as if warning of something yet to come. Jack knew that the calm wouldn't last. The storm was coming, and they would have to face it, together. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet of the cabin remained uninterrupted, but Jack could feel the change in the air. He had grown accustomed to the solitude of his ranch, but now, with Iona by his side, there was a weight in the air, a quiet tension that neither of them spoke about, yet both felt deeply. The world outside seemed to close in on them, and every day brought a new sense of urgency, as if something was on the horizon. The men who had come for Iona were not the only ones who had been watching, and Jack knew it. He could sense it in the way the wind shifted, in the way the birds no longer sang in the early mornings. The calm before the storm. One afternoon, as Jack worked outside on the fence line, he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves. His heart skipped a beat. This time, the riders weren't distant, they were close. The thrum of hooves grew louder as the riders neared, and Jack's hand instinctively went to his rifle. He turned to look at Iona, who had already come outside, standing on the porch with the same calm expression she always wore. She had a presence that, despite everything, brought him a sense of peace. "We're not alone," Jack said, his voice tight. Iona nodded, her gaze steady. "No," she replied quietly. "They will come again. But this time, we will be ready." Jack didn't question her. She had lived through more than he could imagine, and her calmness only reinforced the fact that she knew what she was talking about. The riders came into view soon enough. This time, there were more of them, at least a dozen, riding fast, their faces hidden behind bandanas, their movements sharp and purposeful. They slowed as they reached the front of the cabin, the dust settling around them like a cloud of uncertainty. Jack stepped forward, his hand still resting on his rifle, ready for whatever came next. The leader of the group dismounted and approached, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Iona standing calmly on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows behind her. "We warned you, Apache," the leader said, his voice gruff. "You can't hide here forever. This land doesn't belong to you." Iona stood taller, her gaze unwavering. "This land does not belong to anyone," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had fought for everything they had. The leader sneered, but it was clear that there was more at play here than just a confrontation over land. Jack could see it in his eyes. "You don't understand, do you?" the leader said, stepping closer. "You think you're safe. But we've made our plans. You will leave, one way or another." Iona took a step forward, her voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you." Jack watched as the tension between the two grew, the air thick with the promise of something inevitable. The leader opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, a sound came from behind him. Another rider, one that Jack hadn't seen, emerged from the trees, his horse moving quickly through the thickening dust. The newcomer was different. His posture was more relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the area as if he already knew what was going on. Jack's hand twitched at his rifle again, but he didn't reach for it. There was something about this new rider that felt different, like he was an observer rather than a threat. The newcomer rode up to the leader, his eyes glancing at Ayanna before settling on Jack. "What's the situation?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made the leader pause. The leader turned, his frustration apparent. "They're refusing to leave," he said, gesturing toward Ayanna. "This Apache woman is causing trouble. She needs to go." The newcomer looked at Ayanna, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the leader. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," he said. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of something more behind it. "You've done your part. It's time to let it go." The leader bristled, clearly not happy with the interruption, but the newcomer didn't wait for a response. He dismounted and walked toward Jack and Ayanna, his eyes scanning the land around them as if he was already sizing up the situation. Jack watched him warily, unsure of what to make of this new arrival. The tension that had been building slowly began to ebb, replaced by something else, an unspoken understanding that neither side was ready to fight just yet. The newcomer stopped in front of Ayanna, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said simply. "I'm here to make sure things don't get worse." Jack couldn't help but notice the change in Ayanna's expression. It was subtle, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, something that told him this man was no stranger to her. "And what do you want from us?" Jack asked, his voice tight. The newcomer looked at him, then back at Ayanna, his eyes softening just a fraction. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just here to make sure you're safe. And to make sure they know it." The words hung in the air like a promise. Jack wasn't sure what to make of the man, but he knew one thing: this situation wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following the arrival of the mysterious newcomer passed in a tense quiet. The group of riders had left, but Jack could still feel the weight of their presence lingering in the air. Ayanna had not said much after their encounter, but Jack could sense a change in her. She seemed to be lost in thought, often staring into the distance as if contemplating something far beyond the events of the day. Jack, too, found himself on edge, unable to shake the feeling that the quiet they now had was just the calm before a much larger storm. The newcomer, who had introduced himself only as Luke, had remained in the area, though he hadn't yet given Jack a full explanation of who he was or what he wanted. Ayanna seemed to trust him, and for that reason, Jack decided not to press too hard. But there was a part of him that couldn't fully let his guard down. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, Luke approached Jack as he worked on fixing the cabin's roof. The sound of the man's footsteps was quiet, but Jack heard him before he spoke. "You're going to need more than just the land to keep her safe," Luke said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of urgency. Jack didn't stop what he was doing, but he did look up briefly, meeting Luke's gaze. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already had an inkling. "They'll come for her again," Luke said. "Not just those men. There are others, people who will stop at nothing to take her. And they won't care who gets hurt in the process." Jack's heart sank as the weight of the words settled in his chest. He had known there would be more trouble, but hearing it out loud made it feel all the more real. "And what do you want from us?" Jack asked, setting his tools down and facing Luke fully. Luke paused, his expression unreadable. "I'm here to make sure they don't take her without a fight," he said simply. "But I can't do it alone. You'll have to stand with her, too." Jack nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had never imagined his quiet life as a cowboy would turn into something like this, fighting to protect a woman he had only just met. But Ayanna was more than just a stranger now. She had become a part of his life, whether he liked it or not. "What's the plan?" Jack asked, determined to make the best of the situation. Luke stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We wait for them to show themselves," he said. "And when they do, we take a stand. We make sure they know we're not going down without one." Jack could see the resolve in Luke's eyes. The man wasn't afraid. And for some reason, that gave Jack a bit of confidence, too. "All right," Jack said. "We'll stand together. For her." The next few days were filled with preparation. Jack and Luke worked together, fortifying the cabin and making sure there were no weak points. They knew it wouldn't be long before the men who had threatened Iona returned, and they needed to be ready. Iona, too, seemed to understand what was coming. She spent her days silently helping with whatever she could, her presence more a reminder of the stakes than anything else. But there was something else in her eyes now. A strength Jack hadn't seen before. It was the kind of strength that came from a person who had been through more than anyone should have to endure. As the days passed, Jack felt a sense of camaraderie growing between him and Luke. They were not friends, but they were allies in a common cause. They worked well together, their movements synchronized as they prepared for what lay ahead. And as much as Jack wanted to avoid conflict, he couldn't deny the fact that they were preparing for war. By the time the next morning came, with the sun rising over the hills in a soft glow, Jack knew that everything was about to change. The calm they had tried to create was gone. The storm was coming. And this time, they would face it together. The sun had barely risen when Jack, Iona, and Luke took their positions, the air still cool with the promise of the coming heat. Jack stood by the cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon. Every rustle of the leaves, every distant sound made him tense, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had no idea when the men would arrive, but he knew they would. This wasn't the kind of situation that allowed for easy answers. Iona was by his side, silent as always, but her presence was a comfort. The weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders, and yet she stood taller than ever, stronger for everything she had faced. Luke moved around them, preparing the final touches. His calm demeanor helped Jack hold on to his focus. There was something steady about the man, a quiet determination that rubbed off on everyone around him. As the day wore on, they all fell into a rhythm. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint sound of hooves in the distance. Jack's heart skipped. It was them. The riders. It was time. Jack felt the familiar weight of the rifle in his hand as he glanced at Iona. Her eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, Jack saw a flicker of gratitude in them. Then, she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the cabin. Jack's grip tightened on the rifle as the riders drew nearer. The dust they kicked up from their horses made the air thick and suffocating. There were more of them this time, at least 20 riders, all hardened men with eyes like wolves, eyes that saw nothing but what they wanted to take. Jack's mind raced. They had no plan to negotiate. This was going to be a fight. Luke stepped beside him, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his own weapon. "Stay sharp," he whispered. Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The riders halted just outside the clearing. Their leader dismounted first, his eyes scanning the area, looking for any sign of weakness. The same leader who had spoken to Iona before, the one who had tried to intimidate her. Now, there was no doubt in Jack's mind. This wasn't just about land. This was personal. The leader approached slowly, his gaze fixed on Iona, who stood at the doorway of the cabin, her silhouette framed by the flickering light of the fire within. "You should have left when you had the chance," the leader called out, his voice carrying the same venom as before. Iona didn't flinch. "I will not leave," she said, her voice steady and firm. "And you will not take me." Jack could see the leader's jaw tighten, his eyes narrowing in anger. But instead of responding, he signaled to his men. The riders spread out in a circle, trapping the cabin and the three of them inside. It was clear they were not here to reason. The air was thick with the promise of something much darker, much more dangerous. Jack stepped forward, keeping his voice low but filled with authority. "You'll leave now," he said, his hand resting lightly on the rifle, his stance unyielding. The leader scoffed, his eyes narrowing further as he studied Jack. You think you can stop us? He sneered. You're just a cowboy. Luke took a step forward as well, his hand hovering near his weapon. This is our land now, he said, his tone carrying a weight that made the leader hesitate. For a moment, the standoff seemed to stretch on forever, the tension thick in the air. And then, without warning, the leader raised his hand, signaling to his men. But instead of drawing weapons, the riders dismounted, moving in unison toward the trees. It wasn't what Jack had expected. It wasn't what he had prepared for. What are you doing? Jack demanded. The leader's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his gaze, something like hesitation. I came for Ayanna, but not for the reasons you think, he said, his voice quieter now, less certain. Jack's grip on his rifle loosened slightly, confusion clouding his thoughts. What do you mean? The leader looked over his shoulder. At his men. We were sent to bring her back, he said. But we didn't know what we were walking into. We didn't know she had allies like you. Jack stood motionless, his heart still racing, as the leader turned his gaze back to Ayanna, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. It's not just about land, the leader said, his voice softer now. There are bigger forces at play. Forces we can't ignore. Jack's mind raced as the meaning of the words began to sink in. This was bigger than a fight for land. This was about something much deeper, something Jack wasn't ready to understand. As the leader turned and motioned for his men to back off, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. The quiet of the frontier was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. And they were all caught in the middle of it. For a long moment, nobody moved. The leader's words hung in the air like dust suspended in a sunbeam, shifting but never settling. Jack felt the weight of the moment press against his chest. He had expected a standoff, maybe a retreat, but not this, an admission that something larger, something unseen, was steering these men. Ayanna stood perfectly still at the doorway, her expression unreadable, though Jack sensed the change in her. Her shoulders softened, just barely, as if she had finally heard something she had been waiting for. The remaining riders lingered at the edge of the clearing, restless, unsure. They looked to their leader for direction, but he appeared rooted to the ground, caught between obligation and something that looked almost like remorse. Jack stepped forward, the dirt crunching beneath his boots. Why were you sent to bring her back? He asked, his voice steady but quiet. The leader exhaled, long and slow, his jaw tightening as if he regretted every word he was about to speak. Because she is not just anyone, he said. Her name carries weight among her people. Her disappearance stirred things we cannot control. Some feared she ran. Others feared she was taken. He shot a look at Luke, then back to Jack. We were told to find her before the tribes did. Jack felt the air grow colder. The mention of the tribes brought a heaviness he could not explain, like a storm cloud settling above them. He glanced at Ayanna, whose eyes remained fixed on the leader. So what now? Jack asked. The leader shifted uneasily, glancing back at his men. Now we step aside, he said. Because others have already been alerted. They will come for her themselves. Jack's stomach tightened. Who? The leader hesitated. Her kin, he said finally. And when they arrive, they will not be gentle with anyone who stands in the way. A hush fell over the clearing. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ayanna took a single step forward, her voice soft but carrying through the stillness. You speak as if you fear them, she said. The leader's eyes flickered. Anyone with sense does. Luke stepped closer to Ayanna, lowering his voice. If they are coming, we need to prepare, he said. Jack saw something pass between them, recognition, maybe even trust. It unsettled him, but he pushed the feeling aside. This was bigger than any one of them now. The leader took a step back toward his horse, his voice quieter. They will arrive by nightfall. Maybe sooner. If you want to leave, you should go now. Jack stood firm. We are not leaving. The leader nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Then may the land show you mercy, he said. He mounted his horse, his men following without another word. They rode off, disappearing into the trees as quickly as they had arrived, leaving a strange silence behind them. Jack exhaled slowly and turned toward Iona. "Why would your people come here?" he asked. "Why now?" Iona looked toward the horizon, her eyes steady, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because they believe I carry something important," she said. "Something I never asked for." Jack frowned. "What is it?" She looked at him then, really looked, and Jack felt the weight of centuries in her gaze. "A promise," she said. "One my father made before he passed. A promise they intend to collect." The wind shifted, the trees swayed, and the birds fell silent. Even Luke, usually calm, watched the horizon with a tense stillness. Jack felt something settle deep in his bones, a quiet certainty. The storm was no longer coming. It was already here. And whatever promise Iona carried, whatever destiny had been placed upon her, it was about to unfold on his land, beneath his roof, with him standing at her side. Nightfall would bring answers. And consequences none of them were ready for. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the land seemed to hold its breath. Jack, Iona, and Luke stood together, a quiet unity among the tension that weighed heavy in the air. They knew the night was coming, and with it, the truth of what was at stake. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, where the last traces of daylight faded into the inky blackness of evening. The wind had shifted, bringing with it a chill that made him pull his coat tighter around his shoulders. The silence of the night felt different now, as though something was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The birds had stopped their evening calls, and the rustling of the trees had become a soft murmur, like a whisper from the earth itself. Iona had not spoken much since the leader had left. She stood apart from the others, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. Jack could see the way her posture had changed, the weight of the promise she carried pressing on her shoulders. He knew she was trying to prepare herself for what was to come, but Jack also knew that this was not just about her. This was about all of them now. "How long do we have?" Jack asked, his voice breaking the quiet that had settled over them. Luke didn't immediately respond, but his eyes were scanning the trees, his posture tense. "A few hours, maybe," he said finally, his voice low. "The tribes are coming. They won't be far behind." Jack nodded. He had no illusions about what would happen when Iona's people arrived. There was no escaping it now. He had made his choice when he decided to stand with her. And he wouldn't back down, no matter what came. The sound of hooves broke the silence, sharp and unmistakable. Jack turned, his heart racing as he saw the first rider emerge from the shadows, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. It was only one at first, but soon more followed. The riders came in a steady line, their forms shifting and merging as they neared the cabin. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle, but Iona stopped him with a glance. Her expression was calm, but there was a resolve in her eyes that Jack had never seen before. She stepped forward, moving with purpose toward the riders, her back straight and her pace steady. Jack followed closely behind, Luke at his side, though the air between them was thick with the unspoken. As the riders drew closer, Jack could see their faces, sharp, hardened features of men who had seen more than their share of battles. The leader of the group rode ahead, his eyes fixed on Iona as she approached. His voice rang out across the clearing, strong and commanding. "You have a lot of courage, Apache," he said, his tone filled with both admiration and something darker. Iona didn't falter. "It is not courage," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "It is simply my path." The leader nodded, as if he had been expecting this answer. "Your path," he repeated, his gaze never leaving hers. "But it is not one you walk alone." Jack felt a shift in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The leader's words carried a weight that Jack didn't understand, but he knew it was not the kind of thing that could be taken lightly. "Your people will never stop coming," the leader continued. "We will not stop until you are with us. It is your destiny." Iona's eyes flickered for a moment, but her stance never wavered. I was never meant to be anyone's pawn, she said softly, but the force of her words cut through the night like a blade. Jack stood at her side, his eyes meeting the leader's with an intensity that spoke volumes. She's not going anywhere, Jack said, his voice firm and unwavering. The leader studied him for a long moment, his eyes calculating. You've chosen your side, he said finally, his tone shifting. But know this, standing with her will not be without its cost. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Jack felt the weight of them settle deep in his bones. The cost. It was a price he would have to pay, and there was no turning back now. We'll face it together, Ayanna said quietly, her gaze never leaving the leader. The leader didn't respond. He simply turned and motioned for his men to follow him. As they rode off into the night, their figures fading into the darkness, Jack stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest. The storm was closing in, and there was no escaping it. Now, whatever awaited them, whatever price they would have to pay, would come soon. And Jack would face it, standing with Ayanna, no matter the cost. The night was still, but Jack knew that it would not stay quiet for long. The tribes were coming. And with them, the promise of a reckoning that could change everything.